rules-based order that is collapsing, fragmenting before our very eyes, that is, has created the disorder that is leading to a new order. When you then look at Africa there, Africa made China. When you look at, so there's always a dominant, political narratives. Africa escaped China in the sense that as soon as they became independent states, and this is where Kingsley's point about the power of one becomes really interesting, that you now have them as new members of the United Nations, where 54 or so countries, at least certainly at a point in time, more than 50 countries, could lift China to its place of power in the United Nations Security Council. We never really talk about that, right? But that power of one multiplied by 50-something is what makes Africa's power. We've never really realized it like that. Then we create an African Union or an Organization of African Unity, where in Kingsley's terms too, it is about an organization of co-equal states. Whether you're Gambia with 1 million or less than at the time, or you are Nigeria with however million, or South Africa, at whatever point, you have one vote, right? When you fragment and use those one vote, but not strategically for the collective, you will never be an India. So what is the feature of the emerging power that we see? I think there's still an ideological base to it. There's an economic base which is disingenuous, because when it suits Europeans, they would think collectively about the collective power that they have through the European Union economy. They would want to engage Africa collectively. But when it doesn't suit them to do so, they engage the rest of Africa bilaterally. And by always not allowing us to use our power of one collectively, we will never be an India. The whole of Africa has about the same population as the whole of India, for example. The difference being that India is under one governance roof, right? We are separated and fragmented, given the colonial history that we have, into 50-something states. So when you look at the feature of this particular world order, some things make that power new for us. Apart from China, which is thinking economically all the time, you have a US which actually has caused the disarray in the liberal order in that sense, which is still thinking traditionally in military terms. But the new forms of power that technology has made possible, that people communicate anywhere transnationally. And therefore, it's creating states within regions, states of people, transnationally within regions. That is a new form of power that has not been that way before. The power of our ordinary peoples. And I also think it creates possibilities for collectives so there's an institutional logic that used to think that United Nations had the global, but you had a regional order in which the regional were, they were subsumed into the global. There's an independent form of action in regions. And we have not realized that as a new kind of power. And I want to close by saying that feature, when you interpret it through an African lens, means that for the first time you can think about dominance through the things that make the economies of the world. I don't think China can be China if it's not thinking about the raw materials and the natural resources that are coming from parts of Africa. The rest of Europe can't think about their mobile phones, can't think about anything without thinking about what we have in Africa. So I see that as power, really, a dominance of power. But this is where the mindset, and it's my last point in this feature, there was a leadership architecture in the past that really kept the few together and allowed them to rule the world on their own terms. There's a new leadership infrastructure, I want to say, not even here. Today, there's a new leadership infrastructure, which has two elements to it: the hard work institutions. And unfortunately, in Africa, it's quite hollow. In certain parts of the world, the hardware, which means the sites in which we perform power and authority, right? for much of the rest, for many parts of the world, the software is in it, clicked nicely. Because the lifeblood of that entire system, of that entire infrastructure is the relationship of leaders and people, how they move towards their common agendas. And that's what actually can be exciting about what Africa can become. But Africa hasn't become it because the vast majority of our people, population is part of that power, as it's part of China's power. We have not harnessed it, and you can't harness it unless you're thinking, unless there's a leadership mindset that thinks of the collective, not the individual, not small group interests, but thinks of using the whole of the continental resources around mineral resources around people. That is where Africa power lies, that can shift the dominant, so-called dominant world order, which is not what the paper is written on anymore. Because to feed the rest of the world, to make them live the lives they're accustomed to, Africa has plenty of what it will take. But it's almost as if we have not recognized our place within it because we're practicing the old institutional frame, which is not worth.
I do. Okay, maybe we try then mark out precisely what is falling apart, Doc. This claim, I mean, it seems to me it might be too early to make that the old institutional orders are falling apart. The world, even in the 20th century, really was never a big liberal democratic social system. There are so many kingdoms in the Middle East. There are so many one-party states. There are so many states that have fallen apart. There's literally failed states or states that never really did form for the past 50 years. Countries where the state really truly never did form in a way that we know it in some other places, a central organizing force of a particular territory through language, political institutions, economics, trade, and all of that, education, culture. In the 20th century, there was Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was called. It was not a single liberal democratic framework. The Washington Consensus, past 30 years of trying to impose a specific neoliberal market economic framework, the East Asia never really played in accordance with those rules. So in a way, how really is it true that something new is emerging if the world has always existed in a diverse form, and these actors, to the extent to which they are acting on a global stage, always had to accept difference?
You know, it goes back to Antonio Gramsci's argument that the old order has died and the new is struggling to be born. And I think we are in that flux now of the new order struggling to be born. And part of the challenge lies in the defiance of what has always been defined as the periphery. For instance, African states were built as a form of extracting resources for the colonial masters or for the colonial powers, never for the development of the African state. We look at the weaknesses of the African state. If you drill deep into that, you realize that colonial powers never did anything to develop the state. They've always used them as a source of resource. It actually does make sense that the metal stock exchange is based in London, and there are no metals in London. So these metals are taken from all over the world, particularly from within the continent. We keep on supplying these critical minerals. So this struggle of the new being born, it's much more pronounced in the African continent because the state was never built with a clear idea that the state must be strong and be very independent. It has some links of being dependent on the colonial masters. But that's collapsing. And that's changing. You find in the new generation that it's very much resistant to that. And the unfortunate part, Doctor, is that what we are terming here as military coups and so on, these are popular uprising against the old consumption pattern in the state left by colonial powers. So you're starting to see a rebellion towards this consumption pattern of the state. And if you go back, you look into the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which does not recognize what is called unconstitutional takeover. Now, unconstitutional takeover is very broad. It would include even peaceful, popular uprisings, even in situation where a repression, it's so prevalent. And if you look at the level of poverty and resources, there's a disjuncture there because of the predatory political elite that the colonial powers have left behind and the culture that they've left behind. So the new generation is rebelling against that. And they're starting to redefine this new order that is struggling to be born. And all of us are struggling with that. And I'm saying the African Union is part of struggling with defining this unconstitutional takeover. How do you call a popular uprising against a dictator that is unconstitutional? A dictator goes to say, I've won 99% of the electoral vote, which is basically unpopular. It defies basic logic. So those are the issues that in the continent we're struggling with. But what Prof is talking about is a consolidation of our resources to use them as a sources of power to bargain with other powers around the world. The European Union found a niche to operate as a cohesive force. That's why if you look at foreign policy, defense issues, they've been evolved to unelected officials who sit in Brussels. In Africa, I mean, I hear now we're going to have the African Union sitting in the G20. There's nothing that has evolved to the Union in terms of powers. So they will be sitting there and they can't speak on behalf of the entire continent because there's no cohesive position that we have agreed. This is
And that was developed.
given to the Union to articulate as a common approach that everyone would understand within the continent that with respect to these matters, the AU would speak on all our behalf. It hasn't happened. So we need to do that. But we need to use the power of our resources to put them in a pool. I mean, take South Africa, Doc. South Africa here, Prof, you know, we have 78% of a platinum resource, a key metal required in the automobile industry. Namibia has 11% of the global uranium, really needed in the nuclear power energy. If we were to consolidate some of the strategic resources, Angola, Nigeria, if you look at the oil that we have in there, we can use that to bargain with the rest of the world. We can use that to project our power. But because we're so fragmented and we haven't had the leadership that really rises to the occasion, I always say in my own view, Prof, that the only time we had a glimpse of strong unity within the continent is when we had President Mbeki and President Obasanjo. And they were trying to steer the ship in a particular direction. But since they left, that vacuum has remained there. And if you look at the creation of the African Union, it's a brainchild of these leaders because they understood the REC that they were trying to develop, that you must build regional bloc. They were starting to come together. But since they left the political space, we've had serious vacuum of leadership in terms of bargaining. That's why part of finding a country like South Africa in the G20, it's not because South Africa is one of the 20 biggest economies. It's because South Africa was bringing into that equation the rest of the African continent. Can we say the same now? And South Africa will do extensive consultation with the rest of the continent. Even attending the G7, there will be a consultation between OBJ, Mbeki, Meles, and so on. They would agree in terms of the strategies to pursue that. Do we have that leadership, visionary leadership now that is able to articulate the best interests of the continent, not of a particular country? And that's where the challenge is.
Prof, maybe the new thing that is having us talk about a new global order is the power of China, which is balancing off in many ways than one, the United States. And we see US administration, academics or intellectuals and bureaucrats constantly contemplating what the consequences of this dwindling power is, which started with the priority of finance in the United States, capitalist development, the basing of the dollar, which basically meant manufacturing went to China. Then they started depending on China for manufacturing because they were focusing on the strong dollar, on everybody stockpiling dollars as their reserve currency. But then they became this dependent on China, and China took advantage of that, became what it is today. But historically, China has been powerful before. It's not known, the Chinese are not known as a people who go all over the world to impose them without colonizing anyone. So are the Russians. But other than that, how else are we to make sense of the global superpower called China? They haven't been this dominant in a global system of this nature before. What kind of a power it is? Someone was saying China is a communist country. By all communist literature, I think we can all agree it is not. But please, that's the first thing. The second thing, I've listened to Chinese diplomats and their constant reference to Confucius, which I suppose is a reference for Chinese nationalism. What is that? What is this constant reference to Confucius and the age of China when they were the most sophisticated, well-developed state across the world? They've got this nostalgia, or rather this reference in their history that they go to, that we have been in this position before, where we were strong, developed, industrializing, and all of that. Maybe I pose it in that sense as a point of departure for your description of what is China, and as a superpower, in what form are we expecting it to act based on these signs, to act on the world stage? The world stage used to be dominated by people who wanted to create the world out in their image. With China, are we looking at something different? Or is it a Chinese Confucius way of creating the rest of everybody out of their image without going at it directly?
You know, a fascinating question. We have to look at this in several ways. Let me respond to this question in several ways. China has actually been on this trajectory for a very long time. It has not actually done something that is radically different from what is intended to do. And if you look at the element it has a gift of its population, even though that population is about, to the existence. So when you look at its attributes, its population and how it directs that population. You talk about Confucius, that's a leadership mindset. It's an example of a leadership mindset, the kind of people we are, the principles, the basis upon which we treat each other. They have that underpinning philosophy that guides them, right? And they never set out to conquer the rest of the world militarily, but did they have a sense of the power they could have in the world economically and socially, which is what they set out to do. If you think about how even in the UK and of course the US, there's a lot of contestation and demands for closure of Confucius institutes or centers. It's really because of what people think about that influence. If you think about leadership literature, how Sun Tzu makes its way into it. If you look at, so the moment you look outside the Western world, you find really solid philosophies for leading and for creating life in common.
For military.
Exactly. So that is one element of it. China has been present in Africa for a very long time.
Longer than the Europeans.
Longer than the Europeans. Trading quietly, doing their things quietly for a couple of centuries. Now, what is different also at the moment is that you see how China seizes moments of opportunities. The moment they were hit by tariffs and the rest of the world was hit by tariffs, look at what Xi Jinping was doing. Touring the neighborhood initially, also getting together with the rest of the world. It's building its alliances as it has always done. But China is one of the few actors that recognizes the place of Africa in its history, right? That recognizes how essential a continent like Africa is to its trajectory. And I think that's part of what we're saying. Now, you spoke earlier about institutions. It's true, it's not always been about liberal democratic order. The core essence of the developmental state is that you can become a developed state, notwithstanding you can do it through authoritarian means. You don't have to do it through democratic means. When I spoke about Kant earlier, it is the idea of democratic peace that underpins Kant's work, that democracies do not go to war. So if you build republics, the inclination to go to war with each other will be reduced. That's what Africa has been sold in a particular way. And even we have, and I agree with you, China is communist, capitalist, socialist, it's everything. It puts everything in the mix. You cannot say that China does not have capitalist. The China we see really understands that philosophy in a big way. What has really changed, which is giving China a moment of opportunity, is that world order was underpinned by particular ideas. At the end of the Second World War, the idea that never again would we have a war of aggression, right? A state attacking another state in the way that we saw was sealed. And of course, crimes against humanity was the other big thing in terms of how you made the new states. Russia and Crimea, Russia and Ukraine has blown all of that open, and I don't think it will be put back in the box again, right? And so when we think about what has changed, I think that order really, really is gone unless something drastically different happens. What I like about Doc's point, what I like about Kingsley's point in the African Union is that we tried, and that's my last point on this, that Africa is the theater in which the new world order that is emerging is most apparent. It's not so apparent in many other continents but this. How is it apparent? It's apparent in the way that you see China navigate the region in its usual way. It's apparent in the ways you see the European Union become an actor in a place like the Sahel and even try to press states on the migration issue. It's apparent in the Horn of Africa in the way that you see the contestation for the Horn and the route to the Gulf, right? And it's apparent in who's making peace for us. It's not the African Union that is doing it. African Union is a spectator when it comes to peace being made on our continent. Therefore, it's a place where you find Qatar, where you find Iran, where you find Turkey, where you find Saudi Arabia. Since when? When Kingsley was talking about that glorious period in the early 2000s, when President Mbeki, President Obasanjo, Meles, others, maybe two others, really shaped a vision for the continent. That would never have happened. That on our continent you have all these people being deep, but what it is in a sense is the subcontracting that is happening in the new global order, in which the US could subcontract Qatar to be a peacemaker somewhere. And you're seeing it, in which the United Nations is not the peacemaker, but now the US has gifted it again through a resolution and the creation of a board of peace. Maybe it breathes some new life into the United Nations, but there's disorder everywhere. And that's why I think Kingsley's point gives us a moment of opportunity to say that collectively, and it's not 55 states coming together all at once, but that you have some leaders shaping the way forward. 6 to 10 of them helping build a collective agenda to negotiate with the rest of the world. This is an opportunity. And we're not seasoning it, so is the leadership.
This point forward, Doc. I mean, this idea that when the world was in a transition before, I don't think, I mean, I think 1945, end of World War, what you really get because of that war is what they call the rules-based global order. I mean, you have a huge institutions that get created, the United Nations, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and ultimately the World Trade Organization. You can name many, many others, Security Council and all of that. But when colonization was at its peak, the reach, the fight over the continent, people sat somewhere and said, okay, which we now call the Scramble Africa. Are we there where seemingly the continent is actually being divided and we are not part, we are not participating in our own divisions? Could you draw those parallels and maybe help us make sense of what are the nuances? Professor is giving that dim view that what is happening literally is everybody else coming to run the affairs of the continent without the continent, and the G20 coming here, it's coming to the weakest, or it's coming at a time when the continent finds itself in its weakest form. And maybe this G20 is the true symbol of the scramble for the continent. Some, I mean, Russia didn't come in the scramble last time. The United States has its own subcontracted companies, but here is the world converging here. Maybe at this moment in Africa's most weakest era, is it another scramble in this new era?
The influence for Africa has intensified greatly. You will see the advent of social media, artificial intelligence in terms of projecting a particular narrative within the continent. It's quite prevalent. But the biggest challenge that we're facing now is a battle for strategic resources of the continent. It just doesn't make sense to me and to the rest of us that we're unable to consolidate our resources and use them to bargain with the rest of the world. The scramble for Africa this time around, the scramble for African resources. It doesn't make sense that...
But it also was slavery, the minerals that developed industries, the gold of South Africa, the oil of Nigeria, some of the remnants of those wars, they truly never really did give these states ownership of those minerals, ownership of those.
Because of
it was always the scramble for the resources.
The destructive nature of the African state. The African state has been built as a source of supply for the colonial power. Even the neo-colonial powers have continued to extract resources in these countries. They do that around the continent. It doesn't make sense that you sit in Nigeria, you can't buy petrol, and yet Nigeria produces large quantities of oil. Similarly in this country, that you would mine your gold, you send to Antwerp, and you buy the finished products later. Because there's never been a transfer of technology. And the main problem is that the research and development in terms of our own governments is very poor. The Chinese are spending about 7.8% of their GDP in R&D. And that's why
in the world.
That's why you're starting to see this development in China. Now, the next battle is the battle of the oceans. The access and the movement. it's not by coincidence that the Chinese have just launched what they call the Fujian military ship. Because of the challenges in the Strait of Bab el-Mandab that gives access to the Red Sea, the Cape of Good will become very strategic and useful. So these are the strategic resources that must be utilized to enhance and allow Africa to better bargain as the new sources of power. But they need to be clearly codified and clearly defined by our leaders. But our leaders are really failing to understand the powers they have. They understand the exercise of power to repress their own people, not to use that power to engage with the rest of the world. That's the biggest problem. I mean, Prof spoke about this thesis of democratic peace, which has existed for quite some time. And the war in Ukraine, you're quite correct. It's shattered this narrative that liberal democracies don't go to war with each other. We are starting to see tension between Ukraine and other countries in the area, and that tension may lead to war. So this notion is completely gone. What we are likely to see moving forward, and I think this is what has to happen in this continent, it's the leaders that will try to identify the future and challenges of the future and use the resources to back that. Have a key strategy for Africa's development. It doesn't make sense for me today that to fly to Senegal, you still have to fly to Paris and fly to. So this question of transport, the Chinese, for many centuries, they have had a leverage over everyone else because of two things: communication and transportation. And they've invested in that. The Chinese, as we're talking now, they are the #1 shipbuilders in the world because they understand that the next revolution in their view will require better mobility to move resources and to move people around. And that's why they're starting to invest so much in this.
Why, Prof, in the sort of new China since 1979 with Deng Xiaoping, part of what they do following many, many years of communist one-party style of leadership is introduce limitations of terms of office. And you've got, since 1979, maybe about 7 Chinese leaders, if I'm not mistaken. One person after the other, maybe 2 terms each. Of course, recently, President Xi Jinping has changed that. He's on his 3rd term, which is understood to be another major resolution of the Chinese Communist Party. But they've had so many leaders. I can count several countries that have had a single leader longer than that in the continent.
Don't tell us about Cameroon.
Longer than that. Whether Africans are changing leaders every 10 years or they've got a single leader for 40 years, it doesn't translate. It seems to not translate, so that it's not whether you've got limitations of terms of office or you've got a single political elite that is driving the country. How should we account for this weakness in Africa's leadership sustainability?
Thank you. My work on leadership studies emerged after my security development nexus work, because I think the single most important factor that has affected Africa negatively and that could impact it positively in the future is a question of leadership, how we understand it. And I think creating positions of authority, let's recognize that is so different from leadership, right? And we bought this idea that we just need 2 terms to restrict people to terms of office and elections, and then that's a magical thing. But we have seen how before our very eyes, elections have become instrumentalized. And there is no leadership system to speak of. That leadership system will come from a clear evidence of shared purpose. And I think, Doc, cumulatively, what you're saying about the continent, being able to collectively negotiate, has to come from below. That if you feel confident that your voice was heard in the selection of your leader, and that leader legitimately has you've ceded your sovereignty, your personal sovereignty to that leader to act on your behalf. Everybody rolls up their sleeves because they're guided by shared purpose, shared vision. We spend so much time doing the elections, and they're so fundamentally faulty because it's a stage of power contestation between individuals and elite groupings that have nothing to do with the future of the people or the continent. I really don't believe in some strict two-term limit. I think it probably was put in there to divert our attention and to take us possibly in the direction of some more democratic practices, but it's then turned into something else. In Germany, Angela Merkel was how many terms chancellor, right? She also exited at the right moment. Even if she did, she probably would have been voted out anyway. Because, isn't it, Albert Murphy's work says situations make leaders. When situations change, leaders will change. But when you have a leader for 40 years, though, it's the opposite side of it. If you have a leader for 40 years that has never, you can't remember the last time they did anything good for their people, but they've remained a caricature of what a president should be. You also need to ask, underpinning both types, whether the two-term limit or the lifelong president is the absence of a leadership system, of an exchange, total absence of an exchange of influence between people and leaders. Because once mutuality is not there, both of them become back cabals, right? That are trying to control a place. I think elections and this term limit thing has been so instrumentalized, we don't even know where we're going as a continent.
But what is practically now? What is this solution you are proposing? What does it look like? A leadership system, or is it a leadership production system? If you were to lay it out for us practically, what would it look like? The Chinese make politics fundamentally professional. It's like going to want to become an engineer, an electrical engineer. You have to go pay time, learn, and they've got measurements of improvement. It's fun. It is the most meritocratic leadership production system in the whole world. Nothing like that you see in the world. At the same time, you've got the Vietnamese, you've got the South Koreans, you've got different articulations. You've got the Japanese, for instance, as well. What is this leadership production side or system for the African continent?
Let me put a radical thought. It's not so radical. I firmly think theoretically and conceptually it could work. It has worked on the continent of Africa because when some of our countries wanted to leave colonial rule, remember how many times they said, let's have a plebiscite, right? First we create for you, because you don't know how to govern yourself. So we'll start with a plebiscite, have House of Chiefs. This house, it takes you 20 years, you're still having one constitution after constitution. In Nigeria, we had several of those constitutions before independence finally came, right? Right from the 20s all the way to 1960 or the time. So sometimes we don't look back to see what can work the other way around. The only way I see to extricate the continent from the hands of these cabals in many places is that you start with plebiscites around where the country wants to be in 20 years' time. So that when we're doing strategy 2040, 2045, it's because we've collected it and had referendum after referendum on this is where we want to be. These are the national priorities. We could have done that in South Sudan when it became a new state. And then you move to, here's how we want, these are therefore the priorities for our natural resources. We want to prioritize education, health, this, and X% of the, of our money will be spent, of our resources will be spent on this. You vote. Sometimes you lose. You actually organize your country's strategy around those votes. Then you seal a constitutional vote around it. We have cemented this for a generation in the Constitution. Only then should you ask, who is best placed to help deliver these national priorities? If it's a businessman, if it's a whatever, you go all out. and you vote on the basis of the evidence they have given you. That is how you retreat your country from rogues, right? But we use only what the West has told us to use, right? We're colonized in our minds completely. Because I think as Africans, ordinary people, young people, all of us, the power of one. Use your vote to determine your country's future. Vote in plebiscites first. Vote for issues before you vote for people. And make that a practice. The real people will emerge because they'll be voted out. Because when people get used to voting for, in referenda, they will make choices that suit them. Or we don't even want to test it. I'm sorry, but that's a leadership system approach.
I'll allow you to close on this.
I entirely agree with what Prof said. At the heart of this is building capacity of the state. The state institution should have the capability to flush rogue elements out. It doesn't exist in our state. In South Korea, if the president decides to do wrong things, the state would flush him out because the institution of the state are so powerful. In our case, individuals are much more powerful than the state.
Absolutely.
That's where the big problem is.
Personality.
Yes.
Personalities are much more powerful. The big man mentality is the biggest problem that we're having. And I think we should spend more resources and time in building capacity of the state. When I used to be in government, we as heads of department, used to have an issue in terms of building capacity of the state. It was a permanent agenda. That what is your department's contribution in building institutional capacity? That has disappeared. She's quite correct. Money now, it's a factor, for instance, in this country in terms of driving politics. Not only here, in major countries, in Nigeria, in Kenya, money is the biggest factor, and you are unable to get the best leaders that you have. Because crooks and thugs are the ones who have access to this illicit, ill-gained resources to contest for power. I mean, if you sit around this country today, you look at different commissions that are going on, billions of rands that are used in terms of trying to flush out this rogue element. But the problem is that you're unlikely to do that until you build institutional capacity. To be able to do that automatically without spending a lot of resources. You don't need a commission to get a criminal to get arrested. You need the state institution to be able to arrest and take this criminal on.
But you also, it seems to me, this referenda reference is some form of a similar suggestion to national dialogue. Let us go and get citizens to say what must be the priorities of South Africa, of the country. And these priorities must be achieved in the following years. Once you have that, then only after that will you be able to say, since this is our national consensus as a country, as a people, I think the following set of skills is what is required to drive this agenda. And once you are able to say the set of skills, then you can say it must be Kingsley.
That's what the Prof is saying.
It seems to me that's why,
the problem statement, this is what needs to be resolved. And then you can then go and say, who is best suited to resolve this? And if you are to do that, you will go, you wouldn't be guided by your parochial political interests, but you look at the meritocracy, who has better merits to carry out this, because it's much bigger national agenda to fail. So we're not doing that. We're looking at our friends to run that, and that's what weaken the institutional capability and the institutional capacity. Until we build capacity of the state to respond to challenges and turbulence, we're not going to get it right.
Absolutely.
So, Prof, in the new world order, without this, Africa will just be another playground for international world superpowers.
Sadly. I see this moment as a moment of opportunity. It's still not late because I think we both agree, Kingsley and I agree that we're in transition to something. But in this transitionary moment, we're not yet demonstrating that we want to take leadership of our own future or take our own destiny into our hands. We need to do things differently now, today, yesterday, but certainly now, in order to occupy a new place in this, because I see others winning and winning our continent, and we are just onlookers in the process at the moment. But that can change.
Okay, thank you both, Ambassador, Prof. Funmi. I hope one day we'll have you physically in South Africa, Johannesburg.
Yes, I was meant to be there this week. I just couldn't. I almost called to say I was going to be, around, but then I didn't travel in the end. I'm sorry, I'll be there.
Thank you so much for creating time to both of you for us here at the African Renaissance podcast.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to Dome.
So lovely.
It's always a pleasure to share views with you. I learned a lot from you.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. Thanks. Excellent hosting.